and the identification of tonight and puzzling a little bit. So let me just say this. I want to say something about where we've been and where we're headed. We've worked through 6 books of the Minor Prophets. Anybody know how much percentage-wise that is?
Half.
Homeschoolers? Yeah, we've been through half of the 12 Minor Prophets, and we've done it chronologically to the best of our knowledge, biblically. But I wanted to take a break and focus on at least Genesis 1 to 11, classically understood to be the big first section of Genesis, which would have been really ambitious and taken a long time. And I'm still excited about that possibility. But then I was inspired to unpack Zechariah for us, which is a long book, to refute certain errors that have been coming up again and again lately with so much focus on the nation of Israel and the Middle East. And as I return, though, to the Minor Prophets, this Zechariah book was the first big break from the chronological approach. We jumped past a couple of prophets all the way to the return from exile. And what I noticed then, as I'm translating this book, I translate the book, very long book, 14 chapters. I start interacting with the commentaries and looking at the EP study commentary by Dr. DeWitt, who I think he was or is a professor at Westminster, if I remember right. Or definitely Westminster or RTS, I'm just forgetting right now. Looking at his commentary, the EP study commentary, it really persuaded me that it doesn't make sense. If you have the option, it doesn't make the best sense to do Zechariah without Haggai, who is a prophet sent by God at pretty much exactly the same time, but who goes to the people, the returnees, just prior, and then they overlap. So Haggai, along with Zechariah, these prophets are sent by God at the same time to motivate the returnees from exile to rebuild the temple and to pursue faithfulness after they had stalled out. We'll talk about that more in a moment. Haggai, though slightly, comes before Zechariah. They both start in 520 BC. And Zechariah's first word from God, you see in the first 6 verses of Zechariah chapter 1, that word from God comes 2 months after Haggai's first word. Haggai's a short book, it's 2 chapters. But then the rest, the first word of Zechariah and onward overlaps with Haggai, which is about approximately, it seems, a 4-month ministry is Haggai's. So this tiny book, 2 chapters, it comes first, but then it overlaps with Zechariah, and it seems it's about 4 months. And Zechariah's ministry is maybe like 520 down to 518. And then they finish that second temple in its initial form in 5. Which is interesting theologically in its own right, but not our subject tonight. Anyway, recall how Zechariah breaks up into 2 major sections. Remember, Zechariah breaks up into the 2 major sections. Does anybody remember what the 2 big sections are, chapters-wise? Zechariah 1 to 8. And Zechariah 9 to 14. Right? Those are the 2 big sections of Zechariah. Classic, pretty much undisputed and fairly obvious. Why do I say this? The first big section, 1 to 8, is broken up by 3 important date markers. Before I say that, I'll just remind you, section 2, right, so we'll say 1, 2. Right, section 2 breaks up into these 2 big oracles, which we said are different from the nighttime visions in the beginning. These oracles, oracle literally means burden from God.
a burden, sort of a direct message. 9 to 11, and then you have 12 to 14, constituting 2 oracles. But then 1 to 8 has 3, broken up in 3 sections by specific time markers or date markers. Unusually specific. This is where I tie it to Haggai. So what are the 3 markers in section the first section 1 to 8? Right, you have 1:1, and you have 1:7. There's a time marker or date marker, and then 7:1. Might remember here, 1 to 6 equals an intro, an introduction. It's a word from God. Right? God gives a word in the form of an introduction. And then we have 1:7 through 6, meaning chapter 6 equals 8 night visions. And then 7 through 8, meaning chapters 7 through 8 is a conclusion that really elaborates on and interacts with the night visions and prepares us to launch into these 2 sets of oracles at the end of the book in the second big section, where you see, as one commentator put it, a collage of kingdom images and the coming Messianic king imaged in these oracles. But they really stand on the foundation of the first section. Now, why do I bring this up? You see, there are these 3 time markers. Something that Duguid pointed out, he's not the only one, but I felt persuaded while I was reading him that it made sense to do these 2 books together, because in total, Haggai and Zechariah, who are contemporary prophets, overlapping prophets, sent on the same basic mission to the same group at the same time, they both have time markers like this, these interesting time markers. 7 in total time markers. 4 of them are in Haggai, and 3 of them are listed here, right? So let me point this out. Haggai, which is 2 chapters, so we'll say Haggai 1 to 2, right? Haggai is just 2 chapters. And Zechariah 7 to 8, which constitutes the conclusion of this first big section of Zechariah. These function like bookends. We'll say equal bookends, intentional bookends, which have markers within them, the time markers, 7 in total, right? 7 total time markers. 7 total time markers or date markers between Haggai, which again equals 4, Zechariah equals 3. I think these date markers or time markers are serving to show us that these books are meant to connect, and their ministries obviously connect, and the time frame clearly connects in God's plan. So Haggai 1 to 2, which is all of Haggai, just 2 chapters, and Zechariah 7 to 8, which again is the concluding section of that first big part of Zechariah. These function as bookends around the 8 night visions in chapters 1 through 6 of Zechariah. Plus the 1 sign act we talked about. I don't have time to get into it right now. But really. So could you see why it would be valuable to take a little bit of time to go through the 2-chapter prophet of Haggai, and then continue with Zechariah. We haven't done Zechariah verse by verse yet, so the timing was still pretty ripe and reasonable for me to come to this conclusion. Any question about that before I move on from this? I just want to make sure it's not clear as mud. No question? Everybody clear on what I've said? All right, good. Yeah, so if you zoom out, you see that really these two books tie together very nicely based on these date markers and the way they sandwich the incredible night visions that are setting up the second half of Zechariah, which then becomes more explicit in these two big oracles showing you Jesus Christ very powerfully. And you see all these references in the New Testament, in the Gospels, especially in Jesus' Passion Week as the coming and conquering king, and also in this last section of Zechariah. There's tons of references you'll find in Revelation too to Zechariah. So it's a very important book among the prophets. So here's our new plan. I think it makes sense with what we started with the Minor Prophets series, especially since, as I said, we got halfway through, and Zechariah is the biggest remaining book at 14 whopping chapters. We're going to go this way. This is my plan, Lord willing. Lord bless it. Haggai, then Zechariah. And I feel grateful that the Lord, I believe, providentially, through my own indecisiveness or maybe flakiness, roped me back into finishing what I started with the Minor Prophets. Joel arguably is the first time and only other time where I went out of chronological order. And partly that's because I was coming to my own convictions about the dating of Joel, as there's a debate about whether that's around like 800 or in the 700s, or is it in the 400s BC? And I landed on the former, that it comes prior to the prophetic books that we've done vastly. So I'm going to do Haggai and Zechariah because that's where we are now, and then we'll jump back and we'll go in order, to the best of my conscience and knowledge. And the order is thus: Haggai, Zechariah, Joel, then Habakkuk, Obadiah, and then I think it would be very appropriate. Anybody know what the last prophet is then, who we're missing, since we already did Haggai and Zechariah?
Malachi?
Yes, Malachi will be last, Lord willing. But I think to get us back into the period of Malachi, who comes in the 400s BC, he's the last writing prophet. He's the only one, as far as I'm concerned, in the 400s BC. So it makes sense for us to then do, and these are large books, but they fit with this timeline perfectly. We'll do Ezra in between here and Nehemiah. And Ezra coming first among these two, which have historically been packaged together in one book. Like in Jesus' day, Ezra and Nehemiah would always be combined in one book. Ezra, I think it's like the first 6 chapters retells the story. It recounts the story of Zerubbabel, the Davidic, the member of the Davidic line, and Joshua, the high priest, who returned and who are being addressed in Haggai and Zechariah. So it's a perfect way to get back into this part of the timeline with Haggai and Zechariah, since we're going out of order. So Ezra and Nehemiah will bring us back to the post-exile time period, and then Malachi. Make sense? Any question about that before we move on? All right, so I've got a little treat for you. Even though tonight on the live stream I called it an intro to. Good evening. Hey, come on in. Good to see you guys. Even though I called it an intro to Haggai, we're going to zoom out now, since we're really introducing an approach to finishing the last half of these minor prophets, and then doing Ezra and Nehemiah in the context where they would best fit. I think it wouldn't hurt to try to fit in a few moments of zooming out and contemplating the general timeline of the Bible, right? So a good book that uses this, it's called 30 Days to Understanding the Bible, Max Anders. He's not the only one I've ever seen do this. You know, some people tweak it a little differently, but it's very helpful to have this in mind, right, to know this. And of course he's using, to some extent, our Protestant organization of the books, the fact that it's broken down into 39 books instead of the 24 of the Tanakh used by the Jews or in the time of Jesus. But that said, it fits our Bible, so I think it's great. You see, you have the 5 poetical books, and then 17 historical books. The historical books broken down into the primary timeline. So this would be the main focus. If you're looking at this, this is the breakout of the 39 books of the Old Testament in our Protestant Bible. If you're really going to use this and understand it in a useful way, this is the key, because this is the historical timeline right here. This is how we track the dates, the times. This is the chronological order of the books. And these would be the 11, right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the 11 primary historical books. Right? If you're used to thinking of the Bible the way the Jews do, that language can be confusing. But we all read the Protestant organization of the Bible, so this shouldn't be too confusing. 11 historical books, and then you have 6 secondary historical books. Why do you think I'm putting them up there, along with Anders and some other people who have done this? Why put them up there as secondary over top of these other ones? Just want to get your mind engaged with this way of thinking about the 39 books of the Old Testament.
Well, they overlap several different periods, so...
Right, the timing is overlapping.
Yeah.
So Leviticus, the events in Leviticus are overlapping between Exodus and Numbers. Generally, right? Deuteronomy overlapping between the events in Numbers and Joshua. If you wanted the basic foundation of the historical timeline, right, from following these events, picturing this in terms of the dates, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, the Judges period, the transition to the monarchy, right, the story of Saul and David and Samuel, and then the kingdom period. Right, so this is the historical timeline. These are the secondary books of the historical timeline, right? We all know Chronicles is retelling the same stories as what books? Right, Samuel and Kings. It's not new it's some new information, some new angles, some new emphases, and maybe different agenda, but same basic time frame and people and stories. So yeah, and Esther would overlap with Ezra after the exile. Sometimes when they write this out, they'll just leave this blank or with the ellipses so you can really clearly see this is a gap. This is a gap in the timeline. Where are they in exile after the kingdom period? Where would they be right here, the Jewish people? Right, they're in Babylon for the 70 years. This is the 70 years in Babylon. Everybody follow that basic timeline? No question or confusion about this being the centerpiece? Good? Okay. All right, so you see the poetical books, the way they fall in. Job would fall in during the time of what book on the timeline?
Genesis.
Right. Genesis covers a massive period of time, right? The first 11 chapters of Genesis cover the whole history of the world until like 2100 BC with Abraham, when God appears to Abraham. But Job is during this book, just during this book. And you see there's a big gap here. And then the Psalms, mainly written by who?
David.
Psalms mainly written by David fall in here with 2 Samuel, 1 Chronicles, the events happening in there. And then Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Who primarily wrote these 3 books? I kind of gave it away by not saying Song of Songs, as the scholars like to do these days.
Solomon?
Good. Right. Yeah, Solomon's books. These come in 1 Kings, because this is telling the transition from David, right, to Solomon. And then after Solomon, what happens?
Divided kingdom.
Right. There's 930 BC. There's a civil war. There's a split. The northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. This this story doesn't change. As we say, we're not going to switch over to the Great Gatsby ever. This is the book. And so if you get this story in your mind, you get this timeline in your mind, you get this relationship between these books in your mind, it's going to go a long way to helping you to be a better student of the Word, to see God in Jesus Christ in this story, right, in this whole story. It wouldn't hurt, once you feel you've mastered this, it would be good to also organize the Bible in your mind the way that arguably Jesus would have, with 24 Old Testament books. Not different books, but combined in certain ways so that there's 24 instead of 39. But we're staying here right now. We're camping out.
Can I ask
39.
you a question? It's
Yeah.
always perplexing.
I'll do my best.
Well, I understand there's 10 tribes in the north, but it looks to me like there's 3 tribes in the south.
With Simeon.
Yeah, because of Simeon.
Yeah.
Now Manasseh and Ephraim make up 2 tribes in the north.
Right.
But what do you do with Simeon? I mean, how come Simeon's not mentioned as part of Judah?
Right, so I think they get absorbed, they get shuffled around. Dan moved too, if you remember that story. Dan moved up north. So there's some shuffling around, and some of it has theological import. Remember, Simeon and Reuben, they get in trouble for various reasons, and that impacts their inheritance. You see the 2 half-tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, they get shuffled in, Joseph's sons, and they get inheritance. Judah, the 4th son, ends up getting the number 1 double portion and being the blessed tribe the Messiah will come to. And you even get Levi being set apart after Israel loses the privilege of having the oldest or firstborn son in each home represent each family as a priest unto his family between the Lord and the family. They sin, the Lord takes that privilege away, and then Levi becomes the representative tribe dispersed throughout the tribes. And they don't have a land properly. They're supported by the other tribes as a priesthood. So, yeah, Simeon really, partly it's because of the way they were shuffled, the way the tribes moved around. You're right, Simeon was in the south, kind of in the enclave of Judah, locked into Judah. But it's the way they moved around. The theological import on the different inheritance apportionments, right?
Can you tell us why the northern tribe is sometimes referred to as Ephraim?
Well, Ephraim is the largest. Well, in one hand, Ephraim is one of the largest. At times, it's the largest tribe in the north. And God speaks of the northern kingdom as Ephraim, in part because of that, and in part because Jeroboam was from Ephraim. Right? Jeroboam is the first king. And Jeroboam immediately launches them into rebellion by building 2 counterfeit temples, one in Dan in the north, one in Bethel all the way in the south of Israel. And so Ephraim becomes associated with him, becomes associated with the northern kingdom in general. Anyway, that said, if you look at this, I want to now zoom out before we move on from this. If you want, you can take a picture. I'm not going to erase it. I'm going to flip this over. You could take a picture later if you wanted to. You could easily look this up. Again, I told you, there's books that use this, like 30 Days to Understand the Bible by Max Anders has this in it. It's a lot neater than other people do it. So where are we on this timeline right now? What part of the historical timeline do we find ourselves in if we're studying Haggai and Zechariah?
Ezra.
Right. Now the reason why Ezra is listed here is not actually because this is something you need to know, because it could be confusing. Ezra actually comes along, I think like 458, right? And then 13 years later, Nehemiah comes along for 40, what did I say? 458, like 13 years later, 445. And so the reason why Ezra, though, is listed overlapped with these is because in terms of the content, at least the first 6 chapters of Ezra are telling the story of how Zerubbabel, the representative of David, and Joshua, the high priest, came back from exile. They were sent back from exile in Persia at the time, and they were commissioned with building the temple, rebuilding the temple, the second temple. And so Ezra is telling that story at the beginning of his book. Like I said, Ezra and Nehemiah were combined as one book, but there is a time gap between their sojourn, or their work in the promised land. Ezra retells the story where Haggai and Zechariah in 520 BC are urging Zerubbabel's people, Joshua's people who have returned from exile, hey, let's stop being stalled and let's actually trust the Lord and find our hope and happiness in Him that will impel us, right, motivate us, strengthen us to trust and obey and rebuild this temple. So let me put some dates down. Before we look at Haggai proper, right, we're going to go to Haggai. Actually, this is a refresher, right? So some big important dates before we get to Haggai and Zechariah. Right? So you have the 722 BC. What happens in 722 BC?
Exile of Israel.
Right, Israel, the capital,
Samaria.
falls to who?
Assyria.
Syria, right? And then, of course, there's a million things that happen in between, but we're really trying to think in terms of exile and return from exile. So what happens in 586 BC?
Jerusalem falls.
Right, the capital of,
Judah.
right, of Judah. Who do they fall to?
Babylon.
Right, they end up in Babylon. Then what happens in 539 BC? Who returns them?
Cyrus,
What empire?
Persia,
Babylon.
From? Well, they're returned by who?
Cyrus,
539 BC, Babylon is conquered, falls to Persia. And you're right, Cyrus. So then you have the return from Persia within a year, like 539 BC, 538. So then, like 536 BC, they've laid the foundation, right?
What do you think it is about Cyrus that he has this consideration for the Jews?
Well, they had a different policy than Babylon and Assyria. Assyria was brutal and destroying people, mixing them with other people so that they would lose their identity altogether. Babylon would take you into exile and use you like resources. They were maybe, in some ways, a little less harsh, but they were very harsh like Assyria. Persia was more of the mindset of allowing nations to preserve some of their cultural identity, worship their gods, as long as your allegiance was to Persia and the imperial language was implemented. That's how the Jews in Jesus' day, the language would have been Aramaic, right? The language of trade and the bigger empire at the time, the Romans were using the Greek that came before them under the conquest of Alexander the Great. So Greek was the lingua franca of the whole Mediterranean in a sense. But the Jews, their language, they were really using Aramaic, which is very close to Hebrew, very, very close to Hebrew. But that was the imperial language that Persia used, and Persia took it from Babylon because Babylon had already created an infrastructure. Babylon had already had an empire, and Assyria before them. And that Aramaic that they used for the empire, even the Persians who had their own language that was not Aramaic, that language of Aramaic, which was useful for the whole empire, that succeeded what was called Old Akkadian, interestingly. But that's a rabbit trail. 536 BC, right? They lay the foundation in a hurry, right? They lay the foundation. What happens in the story? Once they lay the foundation, the returnees from exile, what happens? Everything goes smooth.
They start getting persecuted.
Right, things are hard. They're persecuted. They face adversity. Life isn't so great. They're thinking, the Messiah is going to conquer the world, bring the nations to us, and we're going to have the Messianic kingdom. The temple will be the greatest it's ever been. Things are very difficult. And so they slow down, they come to a halt, and then you're talking by like 520 BC. This is now where God sends Haggai, who is 2 chapters, as I said. It's about a 4-month ministry. There are 4 time markers in Haggai. and that allow us to see that it overlaps in 520 BC with Zechariah, right, which is approximately 520 to 518. At this time, God comes to them through these prophets and is calling them to trust and obey, right? And this is the stuff that we're going to learn about verse by verse, section by section, chapter by chapter. And this is when they get their act together and they get it in gear. And then by 516 BC, what happens of note in 516 BC? Interestingly, 70 years after the fall of Jerusalem. What happens in 516 BC that's noteworthy?
Complete the temple.
The second temple is completed. Right? Second temple done. I'm going to say more about that if I have time. So what I want to use, anybody want to take a picture of this right now? Actually, I'm going to flip it over. You don't have to if you don't want to. If it would be useful, you can. Again, there are books that have this, like I mentioned. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, we could say so much. If you just have this, if you had this written and you put it in your study, where you study your Bible, do your devotions, you had it in a book on your desk or somewhere, you meditate on this even, it is profoundly helpful, right? You think about how many prophetical books are there before I move on?
17.
Right there, 17, just like the 17 historical books. Notice 12 of them happened during what part of the Bible? Second Kings. All in Second Kings, basically. Why do you think that is? That 12 of the prophets, there are none of those. Granted, there are other prophets, but I'm talking about the writing prophets, which is very significant. That is a significant distinction, right? Elijah, very important, not one of these, comes before them. And there are the major prophets, right? Isaiah, who else? Who's another major prophet? Ezekiel,
Jeremiah.
right. In our Bibles, we call Daniel, others too. But anyway, what do you think this is? That suddenly there are 12 prophets all happening at this time.
Well, things are leading up to the exile. I guess they're going astray.
Sorry, this includes the major and minor. Major just meaning bigger. Minor relative to smaller. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, considered written by Jeremiah and Baruch, his scribe. What did you say? What is the reason?
Well, they're headed for exile. They're getting warnings that they're not heeding.
Right, it's coming to the end of the kingdom. Who is at this point when you're coming down to the very end of the kingdom, 586 BC? Who are the kings that the prophets are talking to? By the very end, this breaks it down in terms of who goes to who. Right?
Is Zedekiah?
What?
Zedekiah?
Two of them go. Zedekiah is the last king of Judah. Two of them go to Israel, Hosea and Amos, right? The northern kingdom. Two go to Assyria. We've done Jonah and Nahum. One for repentance and one for judgment. One, Edom, the descendant of Esau, is Obadiah. So one goes to Edom, neighbors of Judah. You see how many go to Judah? 1, 2, 3, it's 7, I believe. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 prophetical books, if you include Lamentations, related to Jeremiah.
Are all these prophets out of Judah?
I'd have to refresh my memory. I could think of a couple of the towns that they're from, but they're all writing to Judah primarily. Some of them are writing early on, before the 722 BC. Like Isaiah is before the fall of the northern kingdom. So it's not like there's zero reference or overlap, right? Jeremiah is squarely after the fall I think Joel is early on when they're still a northern kingdom. We could go on a little bit, but I don't want to go too sidetracked. My point is you have all of these prophets during 2 Kings, and you're right. I mean, it's basically that God is warning them, and God is preparing them, and God, the prophets, and even these poetical books up here are commenting on the history, on the historical narrative. The story of God's dealings with his elect people are being explained, interpreted for us, commented on for us by God through his authorized prophets. And God starts to talk a whole lot when he's about to judge the kingdoms, and ultimately he sends the most communication, why do you think, to Judah? Why so much attention to
that's
Judah?
where the Messiah is going to be going from.
Right, the line of David, the house of David. The house of David is going to be judged for its sin, including David's sin, including Solomon's sin. God's going to judge them, and it's actually going to look during exile like the house of David is done for. Like they're crushed. Like it's going to take
A resurrection.
a stunning redemptive reversal in the form of a what?
Resurrection.
A resurrection. And we've talked about that. We've put on the board the way the northern kingdom becomes a kind of the reprobate, the non-elect, because they do not get a resurrection. The southern kingdom is returned. And you're right, it is. It's a kind of resurrection. And the reason is because God still has promised the saving seed. Jesus Christ is going to come to the line of Judah. Right? And then during the exile, you have Ezekiel and Daniel are the most significant. Haggai and Zechariah. So you have 5 after the exile. I told you why Ezra lines up here. Even though Haggai and Zechariah are in 520, and Ezra's almost 100 years later, it's because Ezra recounts some of this story for about 6 chapters. And then Malachi, the last writing prophet. He's the only prophet that comes in the 400s, in my understanding and view. Right? 400s BC. And the last. All right, any question before we go on? We don't have a lot of time. I'm going to flip this over now. Anything you want to say or you want to ask about that? Or add? No? Going twice? 3 times it's sold. All right.
Is there any kind of parallel between the 400 years between Malachi and Christ and the 400 years in Egypt?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. You know, like I don't know how much solidity there is to that, but I've had that thought.
Essentially, there's
Yeah.
period.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah, definitely.
Even to think of them in terms of our country, you can get a sense of how long that is.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely. It gives you reason to think about it for sure. I don't know if there's enough textual connections to give warrant, but God does not do things randomly, and we see it's almost everything you look at. If you look hard enough, you'll find that there's theological meaning. And God doesn't waste words in his story. But that's a good question. I can't say I know that for sure, but I definitely have thought about it. I'm sure other people we know have thought about it. All right, so we only have a couple minutes. What I'm going to do, I just want to tell you real briefly, I'm going to kind of skim in the ESV because it serves just fine for this tiny little 2-chapter book. The introduction in the ESV Study Bible, the very first verse of Haggai tells us that's the prophet Haggai. We don't get a lot of information. Anybody know what Haggai means? What the name means? It's a Hebrew name. Chag is feast. His name means festive. You might notice, almost always, I have trouble even thinking about a prophet who doesn't have a name that has import for the book and the message of his ministry. It's pretty common. It's the norm. With festive, why do you think that might be of interest? Why would that have some kind of theological import? I'm not even arguing that it absolutely does. I just want to hear what you think. Do you think that festival or festive, a name like that, could have theological import in the context we're in? Any thought? I see 2 people with gears going and a little smoke. And a couple I can't interpret. And one I'm going to talk to after. So, if you think about it, my feasts, what's the significance of the festivals in the Bible? What's the significance of that?
They're at the temple.
They're central to the worship system. Right? The people are required to go to the temple annually. So that's something to think about. Right? I don't think it's as obvious as some of the other books where the name is very clearly used in the book. Sometimes it's obscured by the English. You'd see it if you were reading it in Hebrew. But some of these prophets, the name is used very obviously, like Nahum is used very obviously, Micah is used obviously. But that said, Haggai. What about the date? We told you 520. There are 4 time markers in Haggai. I'm just going to repeat this because a couple people came in a little bit later. There are 4 date markers in Haggai that overlap with the date markers. There are 3 date markers in Zechariah, 7 total. And it very, I think, strongly appears that these date markers suggest to us that these 2 chapters of Haggai and the last 2 chapters, chapters 7 and 8 of Zechariah section 1, right? Zechariah's first big section is chapters 1 through 8. There's a conclusion, chapters 7 and 8. There's bookends between Haggai 1 through 2, the 2 chapters of Haggai, and then Zechariah chapters 7 and 8. Those bookends are pointing toward the middle, which is 8 nighttime visions, right, in Zechariah, and 1 sign act that caps off the 8 nighttime visions. So Haggai and Zechariah really do go together as a unit. What is the theme? We've already said it, I think, pretty clearly. The restoration of the Lord's house, the temple. And how is that central to God's promise to David and his house? Kind of giving it away. The theme of rebuilding the temple. There's a covenant with David. And I assure you that ties in with the promises to Abraham that are still outstanding. And the only reason why God has preserved Judah in exile in Babylon and Persia is because of this promise. What's the significance of them rebuilding a house for God?
Because Christ has to come into it. It says in Malachi that he comes into his temple.
Remember, the glory departed. In what book are we told the glory of God departs? It's actually one of the prophets who's going to prophesy during the exile.
Is it Judges of 1 Samuel?
Daniel.
Well, Daniel actually is a exile prophet, so that's a good thought. There's
When Eli
Ezekiel.
falls backwards.
Ezekiel. Yeah. So Ezekiel tells us the glory's departed. So there's a big question. Where's the glory? Is the glory coming back? Or is the whole point of the temple and the people is that the center is the living God?
Well, doesn't Ichabod mean that?
Yes, Ichabod does mean, yeah. Kavod is glory in Hebrew. Yeah, Ichabod, the glory has departed. When Eli, his 2 wicked sons are judged by God, they come back, they tell him, your sons are dead, they died in battle with the Philistines. The Ark of the Covenant's been taken, because like morons, we thought that would win the battle if we just brought it out like a magical, trinket. And Eli falls backwards, breaks his neck, and the child who's being born at the time to his family is named Ichabod, right? The glory has departed.
And his mother dies in childbirth.
Yeah, it's curse. But the point is this, the covenant with David is all about providing an everlasting king. And if you're going to have an everlasting king, what else are you going to have? An everlasting what? Kingdom with an everlasting people. And the promise is, God uses a metaphor. Oh, David, you want to build a house for me? Yes, it's good that you don't want me just, present with you in a movable tabernacle. You should build me a better house than you have in Jerusalem. That's a good thought. That's a righteous thought. But I'll build your house. You won't build my house. Because the point is, God doesn't really dwell in a temple made by the hands of man. The temple's a representation of his presence at the center of their worship system, because the worship system is preaching the need of the greater everlasting king. And the house that he's going to build, right, is the church, the living temple, Jesus Christ, in union with Jesus Christ. So there's an important symbolism here in the returning people, right? They're building another temple. The second temple that they're going to build is going to be, tell me in your reading of the Bible, the second temple that they build, more or less impressive than the first one built by Solomon?
Way less.
Yeah, that's not exaggerative. Way less. Like people, we're going to see weep who knew better at how sad it is. And this is why, though, when you hook the two books together, you see in Zechariah 4, there's a message, right? Don't despise the times of the days of small things. Not by might, not by the way of the world, not by the customs of men, not by your expectations or metrics, by my power, my spirit, right? And my redemptive plan, my sovereign decree. So the fact that there's a lackluster temple, I think that actually, because time is short, I'm gonna leave us with this thought, just to kind of bring Christ front and center a little more, hopefully. Lord help me. I think there is an analogy here with the humbled returnees. Right, what we're gonna see when we study these two books. These returnees have come back, they're true, at the beginning they're probably shocked that God has preserved the line of David and he's actually returned them according to what he promised, what you could see in Daniel, what you could see in Jeremiah, what you could see of God's promise from 2 Samuel 7. God has not forgotten that, as Zechariah means, Yahweh has remembered or remembers. He has not forgotten his promises, and so here we are, but why is it not the impressive, messianic, everlasting, all-powerful, dominion-taking, world-beating kingdom that the Bible seems to be promising to us? And I think that what this is teaching us is that there are two phases to God's kingdom, right? And what are the two ways that we describe this? If you've been in any kind of amillennial church, which is definitely my teaching, if you've been here for any of my teaching for a modicum of time, what are the two phases of God's kingdom? How do we describe those? I'll
The
give you a hint.
inauguration and the consummation?
Yeah, inauguration, consummation. You could say this too.
Already in a night.
Something I was thinking of that might help. I don't think you need to remember this because it should be pretty simple. But some people, they need helpers. Any victory? And everybody's always talking these days. What about victory? Don't we win? We win. We win here and now. We win in time and space. History. You're not a loser, right? Any victory? Already? Not. What am I going to say? Already? Not yet. Right. So there's an already and a not yet. So you see with the people, right, God, he sets up a picture of the church. Their return from exile, the kingdom, right? Okay, he's paying up and being accountable to his promises. But it sure looks like he's falling short. And it's humbling, it's a little embarrassing, it's a little scary, and it's very tempting to find no happiness in this whatsoever. No courage in this, no satisfaction whatsoever. Well, the church could feel the same way. Christ already at the cross has won his victory. Was it a decisive victory at the cross?
Yeah, of course.
Completely decisive. Is Christ at the right hand of glory, at the right hand of the Father now? Right? Is Christ in any danger of losing his kingdom? Is the church ever going to fall prey or fail at the gates of hell? No.
Prevail.
No, we shall prevail and they shall not prevail. Right? So we are already reigning with him in some sense, and he is king, and he is sovereignly working all things together for the good of those who love him, namely his church. Right? So the challenge is to renew our minds, not for us to tweak and manipulate and distort and pervert his plans or his word to fit our expectations, our metrics, our desires, but rather to renew our minds, Romans 12, 1 through 2, to see everything in terms of his plan, which is he's already king, but the model of victory for this age is the cross. So not yet fully consummated. And so you see, notice, they're in the midst of, and this is the last thing I'll say, they're in the midst of a temple building project, which represents the house of God, right? The presence of God with his people. Well, Jesus has restored the presence of God to his true people. True Israel is Jesus Christ, everyone in union with him covenantally, legally, spiritually, is true Israel, Jews and Gentiles alike, from every tribe, tongue, and nation. We are the house of God, living stones, as we're told both in Peter and elsewhere. And we are the living temple of God, already being built. So we have a project right now, and we are to not be discouraged. We are to not fear, and we are to not be as idolaters. We're to trust and obey, and not fall into idolatry, seeking to find our happiness somewhere other than Jesus Christ, and the glorious treasures of having and knowing our God as we suffer and share in his glorious sufferings for his name. Right, for his name. We are building, I should say this, Jesus Christ is building his glorious temple. And we are to stand on the strength and the foundation of his already accomplished victory. That out of a worshipful, grateful, joy-driven, right, contentment and obedient, worshipful obedience. Right, we're getting him glory by being his instruments to build his temple, the church, in this age. While the whole world looks on, laughs, opposes us, mocks us, beats us, kills us, jails us, the kingdom advances and it steamrolls the universe. They just don't see it yet. Satan laughs at the cross, and then in an instant, when the time is up and God is ready to wrap up the consummation, suddenly things don't look so good because he's king. He's won. Right? So I think that's going to be the big overarching gospel lesson for us in these two books. Right? We're to take heart and to see ourselves, we're people where our king is already reigning, we've been restored, and we're under his ordinances, we're under his system, we're under his reign and his worship. However, it looks like we're still under the empire of the world. And so it could feel very much like a loss, like a failure. But it's not a failure. And so we keep faithfully building.